Hello and welcome to The Wild Side. That was Kelly Jo Phelps with Spit Me Out of the Whale. And as you might guess, this week I'm going to be talking about the natural history of whales. And a lot of my shows recently have been inspired by some books that I've been reading, and this one is no different. So I have recently been looking into Philip Hoare's book, The Whale, in Search of the Giants of the Sea. And this is actually the American name of the book. It was first published in the UK several years ago, and it was called Leviathan. And under that title at that time, it won the 2009 Samuel Johnson Prize for Nonfiction. So this is a book that's been quite well received. And actually I thought that it was all going to be about the whales themselves, and it turns out that it's actually about lots of things, kind of the author's own interest in whales and why he's intrigued by them, so kind of his own explorations of why he finds these animals so fascinating. But also he kind of looks at the interactions between humans and whales over the history. And of course one of the big points that he inevitably focuses on is Moby Dick and the writing of that book, but also the stuff that that book talks about. So the history of whaling and some of the kind of violent interactions that have happened between humans and whales over the years. And all of this stuff, he mingles it all together, so you're kind of talking about a personal story in one instance and then a little tidbit about whales the next, and then you get some natural history stuff and you get some conservation stuff thrown in, so it's really all over the place. And actually it is quite an interesting journey that he goes on all throughout time, throughout the evolution of whales, throughout the evolution of our relationship with them. And it's actually quite interesting, although it totally is not what I was picking it up hoping to find. And one of the things that I thought was really fascinating was that he talks about how Moby Dick actually is based on lots of other books that Herman Melville was accessing at the time. So there were some books that we even have the library records from when he checked them out. We know that he had them for well over a year because he was really intensely studying these things. And it turns out that a lot of the stuff that he put into Moby Dick, he just stole basically right out of other authors' works. And some of those were fictional accounts, some of them were artists' renderings, some of them also were non-fictional accounts, so people who had gone out on whaling vessels to kind of study whales and dissect them after they'd been brought out of the sea, and had made observations about where the animals were found and how they acted when they encountered humans. And what I found really amazing was that some of the research that he was drawing on, stuff from the 18th and the 19th centuries, that still remains in many cases some of the definitive work, because we have been studying whales since then, but it's just incredibly hard to find them and to track them over long periods of time, and to do the kind of research that we like to do in order to get a really clear idea of what's happening. We need a sample size of more than just a handful of individuals, so we know that something is a consistent pattern amongst these animals, and not just something that you see here or there in some unusual circumstance. And so because of this kind of lack, this general lack of research, I wanted to look into what we do know, and where are the gaps still, and what are the things that we do kind of finally have a handle on now that we have begun to study these in a bit more detail. And even in the last few years since Philip Hoare first put out this book, there have been some really amazing advances in technology that have allowed people to study these animals over larger areas, over longer time spans in a single go, because we're able to attach tags to them that stick on for much longer. They've developed some new techniques, and I've even talked about some of those on the show. So for example, the fact that they're able to use dogs to spot whale poo once it floats to the surface, and then go collect that and analyze it to look at hormone levels and to get an idea of how stressed they are by human activity in the area. So all sorts of things like that have begun to put together a bit better of a picture than even was around a few years ago when the author first wrote the book. So I wanted to just look into that, and that is what I'm going to be talking about today. So first things first, what is a whale? Well, interestingly, the word whale actually has been applied commonly to all animals in the order Cetacea. So not just what we actually would call a whale, for example, a humpback whale or a sperm whale, but also dolphins or porpoises. But I think probably most of us, when we use the word whale, we aren't referring to dolphins and porpoises. We're talking about everything else that's in that order. Now, like us, cetaceans are mammals, and this was something that actually was first realized by Aristotle in the 4th century BC, but it wasn't actually classified as such and kind of officially, scientifically recognized as being accurate until Linnaeus did so in 1773 when he was going through and cataloging all the organisms that he was aware of. So in between these dates, whales were viewed in a number of ways, and one of these actually was as scaleless naked fish. And basically that was quite a convenient thing for Christians who needed to eat meat on fast days. And this is not the only species that they kind of cataloged in a bit of a suspect way because it happened to be convenient. And probably they were kind of aware that this wasn't perhaps the most precise way to classify the animal, but it was good enough for their purposes because it was kind of useful. But finally, by the 18th century, people did kind of admit that this was an animal that was very much like us. Now, all whales fall into one of two suborders, and actually not just whales, but cetaceans. So the first of these is the Mycete, and these are the baleen whales, which are filter feeders that use baleen, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in detail later, in their upper jaws to harvest plankton from the water, and these guys have two blowholes. The fossil record shows that these are descended from toothed ancestors, so they're like their relatives in the other suborder that I'll get to in a second. And we actually still see in embryonic mysticetes, sorry, it's very hard to say, that they actually do still have teeth, and these are later replaced by baleen during development. So that is the ancestral state, to have teeth, and the baleen is this really special adaptation. Now, the suborder contains 4 extant families, so 4 families that are still found. They're not just in the fossil record, and this includes a total of 15 species. The 4 families are kind of situated along a spectrum, and on one end of that spectrum you've got the right whales, and these guys have very large heads. They have an arched upper jaw. They have very long and narrow baleen plates. And then on the other end of that spectrum is the rorqual whale and all of the different rorqual whales. It's not just one. And these have short heads and short, wide baleen plates, so they're pretty much the opposite of each other. And then the other 2 groups kind of fall in between those 2 things and have traits of both. And these include the pygmy right whales and also the gray whale, of which only a single species remains today. Now the other subgroup is the Odontoceti, and these are the toothed whales. And these guys have sharp teeth because they are still hunters. So I guess you could think of the baleen whales as hunters as well, but on a very, very small scale. But these guys tend to be a bit more ferocious and a bit more obviously predatory, especially things like the orca. And they have a single blowhole, so that's another thing in addition to the teeth that helps set them apart. And this group includes not only all the animals that we would actively call whales, but also the dolphins and the porpoises. And there are actually lots of families and lots of species, and I couldn't find a total that had already been calculated, so I just found a list and counted down it. So if I counted correctly, there are 10 families and 76 species. So the bulk of cetaceans that you probably could think of off the top of your head are likely Odontoceti. They fall in this group. And all of these guys have huge variation in habitat and morphology. So for example, this group includes things like freshwater and saltwater dolphins, and actually orcas fall into that latter grouping. It includes species with several teeth, but also species with a single tooth, so things like narwhals. These are quite large things, but also quite small things, like the little porpoises that swim around here in the harbor or swim up some of the rivers. So this is a whole lot of variation in this one single family. And that kind of gets to the next topic, which is how did whales evolve? Well, whales are descended from terrestrial animals that took to the water. And this is kind of interesting because basically this means that they're aquatic descendants of terrestrial descendants of aquatic species, since species most likely did, since all living species did likely evolve in the water before going to land and then coming back again in the case of some species. So their terrestrial relatives were in the order Artiodactyl, and this contains even-toed ungulates. And a close relative of both terrestrial and aquatic artiodactyls is the Endohyus, and this was a semi-aquatic ungulate that was not unlike a deer. And these guys split from the species approximately 4 million years previously. So knowing that they have this kind of ancestor makes it probably not very surprising that the species eventually had relatives that took more completely to the water, because obviously there were these kind of water-living tendencies quite early on. Now, primitive cetaceans did not become fully aquatic until about 5 to 10 years after they began this kind of watery lifestyle. So they might have had this kind of intermediate phase of living, not unlike the hippopotamus. So you've got them spending quite a lot of time in the water, being very large and showing some signs of having a morphology that's adapted to being in the water. So we know that hippos, for example, are, they're quite heavy. It's not easy for them to walk around on land. They're not able to jump because they're so heavy and their legs just can't tolerate it. So they might have had traits like that predisposed them to spending a lot of time in the water, but they still had a kind of a shape and a size and a general practice of allowing them to be on the land. Now, another reason that we think that there probably is this similarity with the hippopotamus is that the hippo can claim whales as its closest relatives, and this was something that actually was theorized for quite a long time because of things in the fossil record, because of things in the genetic records. So there were DNA analyses of hippos and of other things like elephants and pigs that people had previously thought that hippos might be related to, but actually these analyses found that they were most closely related to whales. And some people really weren't able to agree with this because it seemed so unlikely. They looked much more similar to those four-legged animals than they do to whales, even though there is that kind of aquatic similarity. But finally, a few years ago, they did find some fossils that supported this, and it found that there's kind of this intermediate thing between the hippo and the whale. And it showed that there was this general progression of animals in the mammalian lineage that kind of branched off at varying points. And so that's how we know that whales are indeed very closely related to hippos. Now, once the cetaceans took completely to the sea, they began to adapt to the environment and display lots of traits that optimized their lives there. And in many cases it made it impossible for them to ever return to land. So I was saying that the hippos are quite heavy, they're quite ungainly on land. Well, there are many whales that are so heavy, in fact, that they could never walk around. Even if they did have legs, they wouldn't be able to support that weight with any structures. They kind of max out at a certain level. And we see this in elephants, we see this in hippos. You get to a kind of a size and there's just so much pressure on your body to lift all of that off the earth and compete with gravity to keep you up there. And some whales have gone past that point now, so even if they did sprout legs, that would be it for them. And they also just have other various things that kind of help them be in the water that actually would be quite awkward on land. So for example, they're very streamlined, so they're more hydrodynamic, so they have a shape that is perfect for shooting them through the water, but wouldn't be nearly as gainly if they were up in the air. Their nasal openings have moved to the top of their heads rather than sitting in the front of the face where we have ours. They have had the shrinkage and eventual disappearance of hind limbs. They've had the modification of their forelimbs into a flipper, and they also have had the growth of flukes on the tail. And after the break here, I want to talk about some of these modifications in a bit more detail, since these are the things that really make whales quite obviously whale-like whenever we see them. Welcome back to The Wild Side. This is your host, Kight, and that was the white ravens with mechanical whales. And just before the break, I was talking about some of the traits that cetaceans began to develop after they completely took to the sea. And now I want to think about whale anatomy in a bit more detail. So first of all, what are the traits that we share with whales? Because after all, we are all mammals. Well, for one thing, they are warm-blooded. They nurse their young with milk produced by the mammary glands. They have body hair. They use a layer of fat to insulate the body. They have a spinal column, and they have a four-chambered heart. So obviously there are lots of things that they have retained that make them recognizably mammalian. And this is something that, according to the book I've been reading, actually was a bit disturbing to some of the whalers, because often they could kind of get along with the violence that they were committing by kind of thinking of these things as just objects or thinking of them as giant fish. But, once they got to the part where they were hacking the whales to bits on deck and kind of melting everything down into oil and packing the meat away, they could clearly see that underneath the skin, once you began to look at all of the inner bits, these things were clearly made up of the very same things that we were. They were just like humans in many ways, but of course they were quite a bit bigger and looked a bit different on the outside. And indeed, we do have lots of things that we share in common. But there are also some traits that whales have that clearly separate them and make them stand apart. And the first of these, as I mentioned before the break, is blowholes. So when whales breathe, we often see them from afar, and in fact, the only thing that I've ever seen of a whale in nature is a bit of a spume coming up as it came up to have a breath and then dive back down, and then that was it. That was all I have ever seen of a whale. It's the closest I ever got. But it's still kind of an interesting thing because they do first push out the old air, and usually they take with it some mucus that has been inside and also some water from the outside that was left around the blowhole. So basically they're doing what we do when we're snorkeling and we dive down. When we come back up, we have to kind of clear everything out before we can then take another breath. And people used to think that when they were blowing out that big thing that would come up above the surface, that was water that they had accidentally inhaled when they were underwater. But actually, what most people now think is that this is water that has collected around the blowhole, because there is kind of a depression there, so it can kind of collect in that little depression as the whale is surfacing, and then they have to clear it out of the way before they can take any breath in. And in whales, the positioning of the blowhole has become uncoupled from the trachea in the process of breathing. And this means that whales can actually both breathe and eat, in other words, swallow food simultaneously. And of course, we can't do this because we've got the same pathway going to both our lungs and our stomachs. And so that's quite dangerous because you don't want to accidentally get food into your lungs. And probably it's also not very comfortable to get air into your stomachs. And we actually do that when we eat a bit too quickly. So whales don't have this thing where they're sharing. They have it completely separated, so they are able to do both things at the same time, which is kind of handy, I guess. And it also means, more importantly, that they're able to swallow food without drowning themselves. Obviously, that would be quite a danger if you are plowing along with your mouth open, sucking in water, sucking in plankton all the time, and every time you did that, you were kind of trying to balance between doing both of those activities at the same time, and how do you kind of separate what you want to eat and what you want to breathe once it's already in your mouth. So luckily they don't have to deal with that. Another thing that's quite handy for them is that the blowholes are surrounded by muscles that keep that aperture really well and firmly shut while the animals are underwater. And that means that they aren't going to accidentally inhale while they're down there. And you must, if you think about where they're going, which can be very far down under the sea, there's quite a lot of pressure. And that pressure would be pushing on, of course, the whole whale, but also on that opening. So those muscles must be incredibly strong in order to hold that shut, even with all the pressure kind of pushing down on it and, potentially making it force open. And they're able to counteract that while they're diving. Their breath can be held for varying lengths of time depending on the species and also the size of an individual. And some can stay down for over 90 minutes straight. And of course, that is useful not just so that you can be down there doing hunting for long periods at one go, but also if you want to do your hunting very deep down, then you're going to have a very good breath so you can get all the way down there. And according to the book I've been reading, when the whalers would go out, they'd spot a whale and they'd get down in their smaller boats off of the main vessel and they'd row over to where it had been. Because often whales will sound and then resurface in pretty much exactly the same spot, so they knew they could kind of count on it to come back to where they had last seen it. Well, they would sit there and just wait for it to come, and sometimes it might just be a few minutes, other times it might be well over an hour, and basically they knew that the longer the whale was down there, the bigger the whale they were waiting on, and that actually would start increasing the tension because obviously the bigger whales were much more difficult for them to hunt and for them to bring down, and they were also a lot more dangerous. So these guys, even several hundred years ago, were aware that there was this correlation between size and ability to hold the breath. Now, whales are called conscious breathers, and that is because they have to be aware of needing a breath and then going to go get a breath in response to that kind of physiological need. And they can never fully fall asleep because of this, and they need to be awake in order to pay attention to where they are in the state of respiration and then to act accordingly. And to compensate for this, because obviously they can't just stay awake all the time, they rest half of their brain at a time. So one half is asleep, and the other half is kind of monitoring the situation and can tell the body that it's time to resurface. And the same thing can help them do other stuff as well, not just breathing. So if there's a predator, for example, that half of the brain would be able to, wake the whole body up and do a correct maneuver to evade the predator. Now, you might have seen some pictures of whales as they're sleeping, because they do sometimes just kind of hang near the surface of the water, almost vertically, so with their noses kind of up at the top and then their tails right down below them. And sometimes they'll do this in very large groups, and I've seen some really eerie photographs of 6 or 7 or 8 whales all just kind of hanging out right underneath the surface with their nose just below the tips of the waves, and they're just sleeping there. And then every time they'd need a breath, they'd kind of right themselves a little bit, stick the blowhole up, go back down, and kind of resume their resting period. So they do have to stay up close to the top whenever they are sleeping, because they need to be able to get breaths at a short notice. But obviously this is not something that is necessarily very good for their health in terms of being predated upon at that time. So humans took advantage of that, and some of their natural predators like orcas have also taken advantage of that. Because that if you find a group that are kind of clustered in one area sleeping, or maybe have been kind of blocked in by ice, for example, something like that, that you can find them all at once and find them in that kind of vulnerable position. Now, another thing that I mentioned before the break is that whales have a hydrodynamic body plan. This is also known as fusiform, which means that it's shaped like a spindle or a torpedo. And this describes something that has basically kind of a roundish cross section, but also tapers at each end. And this is the same shape we see in lots of different things that are in the water. Manatees have this shape, seals have this shape, and actually this is something I've talked about before on the show when I was discussing the biology of mammals in general, and I talked about how mammals that are in aquatic environments tend to all share these sorts of characteristics. So this is something that obviously is not just going to be found in whales and in dolphins and porpoises, but pretty much all of these things that have evolved to deal with swimming around quickly. This is why we also see it even in penguins as well. On top of this, they also have appendages that are paddle-shaped, which gives them maximum contact with the water, which means that they also then have maximum ability to push against that medium in order to maneuver around. So pushing them forward quickly, but also if they want to go in one direction or another, enabling them to switch around very quickly and get to where they need to go. And this is actually the same reason why whenever we are swimming, when we're doing laps, for example, we have our hands kind of we hold it in that mitten shape rather than sticking it out like a glove. We don't want our fingers to all be separate. We want to put them together in that paddle shape so that we have a nice kind of thing to swipe with the water and help propel us forward. And the same principle applies for animals that are in the water all of the time. Another thing that they have that helps them maneuver in the water is flukes on their tail. And these are also paddle shaped, so they're quite flat, and they're moved up and down. And this is quite different from what we see in fish, for example, which have these tails that go from side to side. And these are two different adaptations for the same purpose, and that is to push these animals forward through the water. And we also take advantage of flukes whenever we put on flippers, for example, when we're scuba diving. And you can immediately tell the difference when you've put on a flipper, so you know what a great adaptation this is. If you're just kicking around with your legs going up and down, you're not going to get anywhere very quickly, although of course it's better than not kicking at all. But as soon as you put that fin on, then all of a sudden you've got a much greater surface area, and you've also got a nice kind of shape that you tend to put both of your feet together, and so you've got this, not only are you kind of extending the length of your foot, but you're also making it wider as well. So you've got this one big panel that kind of is just shifting you against the water, and it is much better for forward movement. Some species of whale actually have rudimentary hind limbs that appear vestigially, which means they don't really use it, but it's kind of just a genetic leftover that you still see sometimes by accident. So just like sometimes you have a bit of a tail stub in humans, you might have these hind limbs in whales. And in 2010, for example, a bottlenose dolphin was captured in Japan that had quite a noticeably well-developed pair of hind flippers that were about the size of human hands. And these were some of the biggest ones that had been seen. And a small but regular proportion of captured whales have also been reported to have vestigial leg bones, so maybe just one little bit that was still left. But there have also been some reports of complete feet with digits and everything, back kind of towards the tail end of the whale. And I looked at some of the figures for this, and they don't have anything that's really recent because obviously whaling has decreased quite a lot. And most of the figures that they had were from hauls. People who had taken the whales when they were hunting would kind of note these things down as they processed them on the ship. And they did find that actually something like maybe 1% of whales had this. But a lot of researchers suggest that maybe it might be even more than that, and they just weren't really noticed because they might be so small that they just kind of look like the other bumps that are on the surface of the whale, and so they don't really get noticed. And it might actually be a larger proportion that still have these things because they do tend, they'll have these little features embryonically and then they'll disappear again, and so it might just be that in some number of these whales they aren't disappearing at the same rate, and that's how you end up with the vestigial feature. Now, the other big thing that I mentioned before the break and said that I would go into in more detail is the baleen plates that we see in baleen whales only, unsurprisingly. And these evolved at least 15 million years ago, and we have seen that in the fossil record. But these actually don't fossilize very well, and what people think is that they likely emerged much earlier than that, actually about 30 million years ago. And this prediction, or this estimation I should say, comes from the fact that in the fossils that we do have, there are kind of morphological shapes of jaw and mouth parts that indicate kind of a supporting structure for baleen. So even though the baleen wasn't there, it likely, this kind of shape of mouth really only makes sense if there had been baleen and it just had vanished over the years and hadn't been preserved as well as the other stuff. And what probably happened is that this particular feature evolved from a hard, gummy upper jaw, and that would have been quite useful and then just kind of become more and more pronounced over time. And this is something that we do see still in a species called Dahl's porpoise. And when you examine the jaw of these guys under the microscope, it looks very similar to baleen on a microscopic level. And so that you could easily see how this trait would just become exaggerated in the species that have much larger baleen plates. Now, the earliest species of baleen whale also would have had teeth, and these could have been used peripherally. So, for example, to grasp things and then press them up against that jaw that I was just describing, or maybe they weren't even used at all. And kind of the use of teeth we do see in Dahl's porpoise still, so again, kind of using this as a good idea of what that earliest baleen-having species might have looked like. But it also is possible that something kind of switched over entirely once that feature was there and just neglected to use the teeth at all. Now, the plates are made of keratin, which is the same thing that makes up our own fingernails and hair. So you're familiar with kind of what that structure feels like. And it's attached to the gum by means of kind of a solid plate. So you've just got a nice gum and then a big solid plate of that baleen that then starts fraying away at the edges, and it creates those little hairs. And you probably have all seen pictures of baleen, and I used to kind of imagine them as like those push brooms, those really thick plates of frayed push broom hair, but actually it is kind of solid at the top, and then only at the bottom does it become frayed. So it's not just all long bits of hair that are individual. It is a solid thing that then breaks apart at the bottom. And so it's much more analogous to the teeth of a comb, just a comb that has lots and lots and lots of teeth and might in fact be quite wide. Now, whales gulp in large mouthfuls of water as they're swimming along, and some of them actually have jaws that will kind of drop down and disengage in the way that snakes' jaws can to incorporate very large prey. So the whales can do this as well in order to get massive amounts of water in as they're swimming. And the water will have lots of things, hopefully, suspended in it that they can then eat. And they do that by pressing out all of the water with their tongues. They wouldn't want to drink all of that because that would just be, well, first of all, it's salt water, which they wouldn't want, but secondly, that would just be massive amounts, and they would just be having to cycle it back through very quickly all the time. So they push the water back out with their tongues, and as the water leaves, all of the little plankton are caught in the baleen, and they can then be kind of scraped off and swallowed afterwards. And some whales only sieve using one side of the baleen, but some whales sieve using both. And these massive plates that they have, obviously they vary in size depending on the age of the individual and the species that we're talking about, but they can be anywhere from 0.5 meter to 3.5 meters long, and up to 90 kilograms in weight, so they can be quite large structures. And when you think about it, I mean, whales can be something like 100 feet long, is that right? So quite large, or 100 meters. I'm now getting my facts twisted up in my mind because I can't think of US units and British units, but they are quite big, and the baleen can actually be, you know, a very long bit, a very tall bit, so quite a big proportion of the body, and quite a substantial weight relative to the overall body weight. These are really massive structures. So after the break, I'm going to have another song here. I'm going to think about some other whale behavior on top of eating and moving around, which I've talked about quite extensively already. Welcome back to the Wild Side. This is your host, Kight, and that was Rosie and me with Bird and Whale. And when I say Rosie and me, I don't mean someone named Rosie and also me, your host. I mean a group named Rosie and me. Now during the break, I took the opportunity to look up the length and weight of whales, and I was right the first time around. Whales can be up to about 100 feet, so 98 feet was the exact figure, which is about 30 meters, and also somewhere up to 180 tons. So obviously these are quite massive animals. Now, before the break I was talking also about kind of their morphological features that distinguish them from other cetaceans and also from other types of animals in general. And now I want to think about some of their behaviors that are particularly interesting and noteworthy. And before I do that, I just want to introduce kind of the phrases that tend to be used with the different age classes and sexes of whales. So males are known as bulls, females are known as cows, and offspring are known as calves. So obviously they're spoken about in much the same way as cattle, as livestock. Now, probably the most interesting thing about whales is the fact that they are incredibly intelligent. And probably one of the reasons for this is the fact that they have a brain structure that's not unlike ours. And so they have some of the features that we have that allow us to develop the kind of mental capacity that we have. In addition to having fairly good-sized brains relative to their body size, and we do know this is quite an important feature in determining how intelligent a species will be. And I should also mention that that takes into account the fact that there is quite a lot of blubber. So that's kind of taken out of the equation, and it's just looking at the actual body framework, I guess. Because whales have a ridiculous amount of blubber relative to all other animals. So in addition to that, they also have a very complicated neocortex, like the one that is found in humans and higher primates. So all of those little ripples and ridges that we have on our brains. And this is one of the key features that researchers think makes us intelligent as we are, because it does increase the surface area of our brain and allow us to have lots and lots of neurons and connections between the different cells in our brains. And on top of this, they also have a very large telencephalon, and this is the area of the brain that's used to, and I'm quoting now, produce conscious mental and sensory processes, intelligence, and personality. So in primates, this area of the brain has been linked with this kind of general social intelligence. And we do know that whales, on top of being quite smart, are highly social animals. They sometimes are alone, but always will congregate in large groups at some time of the year. And of course, things like dolphins we know are in large pods almost all of the time. And so, there is no coincidence that this incredible brain power is linked up with a lot of social activity, just as we see in primates, including humans. Now, another thing that's interesting in whale brains is that they have something called spindle neurons. And before 2007, when these were found in sperm whales, they had only been seen in hominids. And these are associated with social behaviors such as conduct, emotions, judgment, and mind. So these are very complex things. This is not just determining whether or not you're interacting with another animal. We see that in lots of species, of course, but very complex things like how you're going to interact, whether you're going to remember that, whether there are certain rules that you have to use to engage, and have lots of steps and particular interactions to make sure you do things the right way and get the response that you want. So this is very similar to what we're seeing in humans. Behavioral observations of these guys indicate that they can both feel joy and grief. We've seen whales that cooperate with each other, and also they scheme to achieve a common goal. We know that individuals can both teach and also learn information, and this is quite important in ensuring that they have a culture where individuals are passing on knowledge to each other, and we're able to see the variations between groups of individuals that have different cultures. So just as we would have kind of regional differences or national differences in humans, we can see the same sorts of things in whales. So there are variations in where they forage, the techniques that they use for feeding, the dialects that they have in their vocalizations, and that's something, of course, I've mentioned in the past in relation not just to humans but also to birds and other species as well. The routes that they use for their migrations, all sorts of things we can see these cultural variations in, and these things can be passed on over time. And what's interesting about these spindle neurons in whales is that they're found in the same types of brain regions in whales where they're also found in humans. And now these may not be morphologically exactly the same, but they are homologous. So there are some subtle variations in brain structure, but there is this parallel between whale and human brains, and that suggests that these things are performing similar functions in our species and also in theirs, which means that a lot of this cultural stuff that we engage in is kind of governed by the same sets of rules in whales as well. And of course, this is one of the big reasons that whale hunting has been so devastating, and that's because in addition to taking individuals that were needed to sustain populations via breeding, it also meant that we were removing critical knowledge that was needed for survival. And this is the same sort of thing we've seen in elephants as well, where you take out a few key individuals that are important for passing on information, teaching others how to behave, where to go, what to do, that sort of thing, and suddenly everything else kind of falls apart because they haven't, you've got these younger individuals that need to learn, just like our adolescents need to learn, and they haven't gotten to that phase yet, and suddenly the leaders are gone and that knowledge is gone with them. So this is one of the reasons most researchers think that we've had such a devastating impact on whale populations. Some researchers have even proposed that whales could have other things that we have as well that we haven't really seen in any other species. So things like true emotions, an ability to understand abstract concepts, and also potentially even religion. And of course these are very rare claims. This is one particular researcher and his group that see some evidence that this might be possible. But given all the other evidence and all the other ways in which they're similar with humans, it wouldn't be, I guess, completely out of the question that they might also show some of these traits. Now, the last thing I really want to go into in detail in terms of whale behaviors is whale vocalizations. And these are really important as a means of communication, also to help them navigate and also to help them hunt. So in other words, not just in vocally communicating, but also in echolocating. And one of the reasons that cetaceans rely so heavily on acoustics, and this is whales, dolphins, and porpoises that I'm talking about now, is that other signals just aren't as useful in an aquatic environment. So visual signals are difficult to pick up, particularly in the deep, where there's no light. Also in muddy rivers where it's just so thick that the light's not penetrating. Also chemical signals, they travel much more slowly in water than they do in air. And acoustic signals are, not only are they not bad, but they're actually particularly good in water. So they actually travel about 4 times faster in water than they do in air, and that makes them particularly effective. Now before I want to move on here and describe some of these specific behavioral traits of vocalizations in a bit more detail, I want to play 4 different humpback whale vocalizations just to give you an idea of the sorts of variation that we see. So those were 4 different vocalizations of humpbacks back to back. So that gives you an idea of the sorts of sounds that I'm talking about, although actually they're across all of the whales cumulatively, there are lots of different types of sounds that you hear, and those are just one representative little sample. But that shows you that there is quite a lot of variation, even just within a single species, let alone across all the different species, and not just whales in general, but also in each of the 2 subgroups of whales. So let's think about the first of those, the odontocetes. Now these guys have a couple different things that they tend to rely on. The first is rapid bursts of high-frequency clicks, and these are primarily used for echolocation. And they tend to occur at frequencies from kind of 0.2 to 150 kilohertz. So that's obviously quite a large range. That can go very high, so beyond what we're able to hear, certainly beyond what we're able to hear comfortably as well. Some of those really high-pitched sounds, when we do pick them up, can actually be really awkward for us to process because it just kind of hurts. Now the lower range is quite good for distance echolocation, whereas the higher range is good not just for distance, but also to get a better idea of size, shape, speed, vector, and composition of whatever it is that the waves are bouncing off of. So basically what that means is you're doing long-range stuff in order to find out, are you kind of in open waters? Are your friends nearby, kind of in your pod? Where are you going? Are you heading in the right direction? So maybe stuff that's a bit longer. And that's what you're doing with those lower frequency things. But when you up the frequency, that's going to be stuff that's closer to you. And that's specifically going to help you maneuver. So when we're talking about maybe coming up to interact with an individual that's in your pod, or to reproduce, or to capture some prey, or to evade a potential predator. So that's what the higher frequency stuff is for. Then they have whistles, and these are used for communications between individuals, including to provide information about identity and also to coordinate group behaviors. And I talked recently about a study where someone has found that if you play a recording of a particular individual to an individual that is familiar with that sound, then they tend to remember this and react in a very specific way, as opposed to if you just play the recording of someone, a dolphin, for example, or another whale, that this individual has never experienced before. And that suggests that each particular species has its own characteristics that indicate it. So our voices, we can tell each other by our voices or by our gait. It's a similar thing. So it's an identifier of a specific individual, not just the species. And they can use this in order to pick each other out of a crowd and remember that over long periods of time. Now in the other group, the Mysticetes, we have song. So this is kind of regular, predictable, potentially used as signals of male quality, that kind of thing that we see in birds, actually. It's a very similar sort of idea, and that's what I was just playing to you a couple of minutes ago. And this is what we see in humpbacks. This is kind of the one that we know best, what I was just playing, but there are other species as well that do this sort of thing. Then there are also species that deliver moans, which are a bit less predictable and even more hauntingly sounding. And these are things like fin whales, blue whales, gray whales that tend to produce these sorts of vocalizations. And then there's a variety of others that are named after how they sound. So grunts, moans, thwops, snorts, barks. And basically all of these things, we know that they deliver these sounds, but we're not really sure why. What is the function? Even with the songs, we're not entirely sure. Because they tend to do it on the way to the breeding ground while they're migrating, and also once they are there in the breeding grounds, that's why we think that it potentially is a signal of quality, particularly male quality, advertising to females. And we do know that they also can deliver these sounds, particularly these low frequency sounds, I'm having a mind blank, that travel really long distances to kind of find each other over vast areas and coordinate movement to kind of a spot where everyone's going to come together. But beyond that, we kind of just correlate these things. We haven't really been able to study it in much detail, so there's still a lot there are a lot of questions out there about what are these things doing. Now we do know that these vocalizations tend to be much lower pitched than in the other subgroup of whales. So they tend to be down in the kind of 10 to 100 hertz range, which is really low pitched. And this allows them to travel those incredibly long distances and coordinate with each other on opposite sides of the ocean, basically. And because of the importance of these vocalizations, sound pollution is particularly problematic for whales, especially because our pollution tends to occur really low down in the frequency range. And so that means that we are overlapping right where the whales are trying to produce their sounds. And I've talked about that in the past on the show, so I won't go into it again now. But that does kind of raise the question of whale conservation. And I don't want to go into whale conservation a lot because I think we've all heard a lot about it and it's kind of depressing. And I really wanted to just use the show to talk about the animals themselves and not necessarily the issues surrounding them. But it is important to note that sound pollution is only one of many problems that these animals face. They also have chemical pollution, and this actually can cause them to die of cancer, and we see them getting very high rates of chemical pollution exposure in areas where they're coming into contact with people. So for example, in bays, at the mouths of rivers that are dumping out into the ocean. So these are the same chemicals that we're being exposed to as well. So to see the cancer rate in whales is actually quite disturbing for many reasons, not just because these guys are dying, but because that's the same stuff that we could die from as well. So that's quite upsetting. We also know that they can collide with ships, and this is particularly true of smaller species that might not just be run over, but also they could suffer from being damaged by a propeller, for example, and have a flesh wound that would last for days and cause them to die kind of a lingering death or to have long-term injuries. We also know that their strandings might be related not just to sonar, so we do know that military testing and other uses of sonar can be quite damaging, but also because we have these changes to coastlines, and whales do remember what it used to be like. They kind of tell each other this in their cultural transmission. And so if things are suddenly changing because we put things out there, then they might not know that, and so they can collide with them, or they can accidentally run themselves up on a beach that didn't used to be there, for example. And of course, they're also still impacted by centuries of whaling because they tend to have very low reproductive rates. And as I mentioned earlier, they've lost some cultural heritage as well. But there has also been some good news lately. So for example, just last week, there was this agreement by Japan to stop whaling in the Antarctic. So hopefully, if they stop whaling and the rest of us don't decide we're going to kind of turn away from the agreements that we've made, that will give whales a chance to recover a bit from these recent pressures. Another interesting thing that just happened recently was that a marine biologist claimed to have created and successfully used a computer program that translated dolphin vocalizations in real time. So she said that she was able to get a translation of what that dolphin was trying to say to her. I don't really know that I believe that, but you know, computers are amazing. Dolphins are quite clever. Whales are quite clever. Who knows? We might one day soon be able to communicate with these species and learn from them directly rather than just studying them from afar. So all of that's quite interesting. I think quite exciting if you actually think that some of those things might come to pass. But also I wanted to mention whales, not just because of that kind of pedagogical reason of just thinking about where do they come from and teaching you about that, but also it is a good time of year to start thinking about whales because we're going to be going out in boats, we're going to be going out along the coast, so don't forget to keep your eyes open. You know, when you're out there by the water, you have a pretty good opportunity to catch a glimpse of these animals as they go past. In particular, we tend to have minke whales around here quite a lot, and I'm going to the Isles of Scilly in a couple of weeks and have my fingers crossed that finally, after 4 years of going on this trip, I might actually get to see one of these guys in the water, so wish me luck. So that's all from me for this week, and I will put information about the book that I've been reading and also about some of these studies that I've mentioned on the Wild Side website so that you can check those out if you want to follow up with them. And for now, I will leave you with Song of the Whale by Undercontrol, and I'll talk to you next week.